Good morning and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining us today for this important launch and exciting program. It's my distinct honor to welcome Ambassador Amaro of Brazil. Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. It's always an honor for you to be here at the Atlantic Council. I'd also like to recognize Adrian Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, and then newly now the founder of the new Adrian Arsht Center for Resilience. Adrian, you helped make all of this possible as a results-oriented businesswoman and philanthropist. Thank you so much. This timely and important report is part of the Atlantic Council's deeper look at China's growing role in Latin America, an effort we're conducting in partnership with HSBC. And as such, let me in particular take this opportunity to thank another Atlantic Council Board Director, Jerry Motto of HSBC, for his incredible support of this crucial partnership. What I know about Latin America, I've stolen all my ideas from Jerry, so it's really wonderful to have you here. And also the OECD's Angel Melguizo for coming all the way from Paris to help launch the report. Angel, thank you so much. China has been expanding its influence far beyond Asia for some time. We already know that. It's also taken a heightened interest in Latin America. We also know that. That's not new. What's new are the resources that have been directed to this going out strategy, which have dramatically increased. This report and our event today focus specifically on China's increasing FDI in Latin America, the changing nature of those investments, and the broader implications posed by them. This new reality is altering the role of traditional partners in the region and may signal a paradigm shift for the United States and Latin America, where many of the countries in the region are looking east as much as they're looking west, or even more in some cases. Many countries in Latin America stand to gain from the increase in investment, especially if FDI from China continues to grow as projected. I was just talking to Jerry about a newly announced investment in Argentina, President Macri, which he'll speak about in a moment, but it gives you a feeling of where the momentum is going. Strengthened Chinese economic relations with Latin America, paired with the potential for increasingly inward-looking U.S. policies, may spur countries in the region to increasingly look to Asia. This report should serve as a wake-up call for the United States and hopefully galvanize efforts in the U.S. to think about and address the implications. Some of them are enormously positive. Some of them are not so positive of the surge in Chinese investment in the region. This report and the event embodies the proactive effort of the Atlantic Council's China Latin America Initiative. Through our partnership with HSBC, we'll continue to shine a light on this important and evolving strategic relationship. We have already released 2 reports, one that takes a look at the overall assessment of the relationship, and another that takes a deep dive on China's currency. Our aim is to look at these sorts of crucial topics in an ongoing and nuanced and substantive manner. This is the first launch of the report, but we will have launch on 3 continents. The next will be in Shanghai, and then the following in Buenos Aires. Today's event will kick off with a keynote conversation between Ambassador Amaro and the Atlantic Council's own Jason Marsack. Their conversation will be followed by a panel featuring the co-author of the report, Angel Meguizo of the OECD, Claire Reed, a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China, Jose Juan Ruiz Gomez, Chief Economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, and moderated by Sean Donnan, World Trade Editor at the Financial Times. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Jerry Motto, Chairman of HSBC's Global Banking and Markets Americas and Atlantic Council Board Director. Jerry joined HSBC in 2002, where he oversees the investment banking, corporate banking, and markets business across the U.S., Canada, and Latin America. He has more than 20 years of experience acting as a strategic capital-raising advisor to governments and large-cap companies across the Americas region. He spearheaded HSBC's growing partnership with the Atlantic Council with a focus on China's relationship with the Americas. Jerry, please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Fred, for that nice introduction. Adrian, thank you for your continued support. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning for this important event looking at Chinese FDI into Latin America, part of the deeper look at China's growing role in Latin America that we at HSBC are proud to be doing in partnership with the Atlantic Council. Like Fred, I want to welcome all our guests and thank you for coming this morning. A special mention to Ambassador Amaral, who I'm delighted to see you again. I'm proud of the work we have accomplished with the Atlantic Council in the area of China and Latin America, and I'm looking forward to a number of joint efforts in the near future. On FDI particularly, these reports provide an important benchmark for looking at the changes and investment and the understanding the resulting implications. Chinese investments in the region can help contribute to high-quality economic growth, sparking productivity and innovation. Economic development has been uneven across the region and has endured economic turmoil over the years, including low growth, high inflation, and financial crisis. Today, we have an improving picture in a number of countries due to increased stability and resilience. Traditionally, Chinese firms focus their investments in Latin America in the extractive sector. Now, more than half of all investment target the service sector, especially transport, finance, electricity, ICT, and alternative energy. This will help push for economic transition from reliance on natural resources to service and manufacturing, and bring new opportunities to ensure a more prospective future of the region. On the diplomatic side, China has been shoring up relationship with many countries in Latin America. Chinese President Xi Jinping has visited Latin America 3 times since 2013, and numerous envoys continue to visit and secure new deals. Some recent examples in Latin America: China and Chile have announced it will upgrade their free trade agreement. Chinese companies are constructing numerous infrastructure projects around the region, many of which will directly improve trade facilitation. As Fred mentioned, President Macri of Argentina recently returned from Beijing, where he signed $30 billion of deals, including financing to build 2 nuclear plants, direct investments in the mining sector, infrastructure, and deals in agriculture. I'm sure that you will hear directly from firsthand from Ambassador Amaral on investments on Brazil. So China financial footprint in Latin America has expanded. The country has made numerous inroads in Latin America over the past few years. Chinese banks have opened branches, acquired local banks in more than half of dozen countries, including several large acquisitions of local banks in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and have signed swap agreements as well. These paint a picture of China's comprehensive strategy to strengthen relations and provide mutually beneficial environment for the future relationships. The fact that the Chinese OID exceed the FDI, the ODI exceed the FDI in 2016 was a game changer for China. Now China has no frontiers in terms of expansion. Now I would like to transition to the next part of the event, keynote speaker, Brazilian Ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Sergio Amaral.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. Second chair. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Jerry, for those incredibly insightful comments. As you say, this is the really there was all new frontiers right now. And Fred, thank you very much for your welcoming comments. I'm Jason Marr, the Director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Adrian Arst Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. And like Fred and Jerry, I also want to acknowledge Adrian's presence here today. Adrian is a true, not only a founder of our center and the new Brazilian Center at the Atlantic Council, but also a visionary. And we thank her for all the excellent work that we do here every day. So thank you very much, Adrian. Ambassador Amaral, thank you so much for being here today to provide your insight on a topic that you know incredibly, incredibly well. You're in a class of your own, not just for being such an accomplished ambassador of your country, but also for your deep knowledge of China and the evolution of China-Brazil as well as China-Latin America relations. We had a private roundtable a few weeks ago. The ambassador was there to help to inform this incredibly insightful report that all of you should have. And because of your incredible insight at that private roundtable to help inform the report, we had to invite you to speak publicly. So that's what happens when you're so doing such a great job. Ambassador is no stranger to all of you. The ambassador has an esteemed career including serving Brazil in Paris, London, Geneva, and now in Washington. He was previously Vice Minister for the Environment, Secretary of Social Communication, and spokesperson for President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He was also Minister of Development, Industry, and Foreign Trade. And also more recently and relevant to today's discussion, the ambassador was the chairman of the Brazil-China Business Council. And then I also want to add on to your bio that you're also a friend of the Atlantic Council, which is, I think, a great way to end that bio. Before jumping into the report, which we will do over the course of the next 15-minute conversation, I'd like to start off by asking you, Ambassador, if you could lay out some of the main points, top points that you see as really defining the China relationship with Latin America more broadly before we talk specifically about Brazil.
Yes, Chancellor, thank you very much. I'd like also to thank Fred Kemp for this invitation. I've been very honored to be here again. I'd like also to thank HSBC for the support for this program. And I would like to thank very much Adrian Harsh, who has made a very important contribution to the discussion and to the production of information and of ideas in Latin America with this center. Jason, I think there are some points which may be a reference to a discussion on China and Latin America. Now, I'll try to highlight 7 points. From the point of view, of course, of Brazil, and in front of you my experience as chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council. I think the economic presence of China in Latin America is very impressive. But more impressive than the presence, both in trade and investment, is the rate of growth. For instance, in the last 10 years, trade increased by 23% in average, which is more than we have been able to grow inside Latin America. Intra-Latin American trade was much less than that. And that is, I think, is one point. Second point is that they have a very diversified presence. It started with commodities, they went to infrastructure, to services, and now financial services. So it's a very diversified in the different sectors of the economy. The third point is that this relationship is sustainable. And it's sustainable because there is a complementarity. We produce what they need. We have minerals, we have water, and we have land. So we have a very important complementation in agriculture. And that gives the sustainability of this relation. But we have to pay attention because this is a completely different kind of economic cooperation. First of all, because of the role of the state, which is present in the decision about investments, is doing the follow-up of what is being done and set up the guidelines for the government. And in the case of Brazil, the High Commission also set the guidelines for the Brazilian public sector. And it's different also by the way of doing business by state-owned companies. Latin America is not alone. We have to take into account that it's part of a wider strategy. And this includes what I call a geopolitics of infrastructure. The impact is positive, but there are also problems. And finally, there are impacts, I think, for the US, because US and China, in my perception, will shape the new world economic order, or world order in general. Be it cooperation, be it confrontation. But there is going to be always competition for areas of political influence and for markets.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that's an excellent overview. Diversified, sustainable, complementary, the role of the state, and I think exactly is what we're trying to do through all of our work on China, Latin America at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center is providing that perspective that Chinese investment, there's positives and there's negatives, right? And we need to figure out how to maximize the potential and minimize some of the risks. Now, Ambassador, you're mentioning the dramatic increase in Chinese trade, but also investment in the region. That's something that we talk about in the report we're launching today. And we've seen Chinese FDI in Brazil grow from $5 billion in 2009 to $60 billion in 2016. $5 billion to $60 billion. Impressive, utterly impressive in a span of 7 years. From the Brazilian perspective, what have been some of the effects of this dramatic growth in Chinese investment in your country?
I think that first of all was the investment in the insurance of commodity supplies. They invested a lot in the origination of our crops, in transportation, in bringing the commodities to China and distributing in China. So they have a very comprehensive view and a very integrated process. Of course, this irrigated the Brazilian countryside. The Brazilian countryside in a few years became rich because these were the commodities the Chinese were importing. So this was a very positive development. They also invested a lot in infrastructure. And in most cases, as merger and acquisitions. And I think this was also important because these were investments that increased our production in some areas, helped or will help, because some of them are not yet completed. For instance, the capacity to take our products from the center west, which is the producing area for crops, to the ports. And this is a big challenge for the Brazilian economy. The financial aspects are not so important. All the main banks, Chinese banks, are in Brazil. But they are there basically to finance the investments and the operations of the Chinese companies. They are not participating in a significant way of the Brazilian financial system. I think that many more investments will be made, and what's interesting about this is that the Chinese have a very clear perception of vision, of strategy. They don't care. Most of the companies are SOEs. They follow the guidelines of the Chinese government, which prescribes in which area they should invest, how. And they have a very clear perception or emphasis on some strategic projects, like in the area of infrastructure. For instance, I mentioned the case of soya. They will be investing in 5 important projects in the area of railway transportation of soya. They invested in a trading company. They bought a trading company. Mm-hmm. They are building ports. So they have an idea of participating in the whole soya chain. And in some cases, this is a purely strategic approach. That's the case of the big railway from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. It has no return at all, but it has a strategic meaning for China.
So a lot of positives you're describing. You make the countryside richer, invest in infrastructure. Are there downsides that you're seeing? Are there certain things that can be done or need to be done to make sure that Brazil is really, in the long term, getting the most out of this investment?
I think not in the case of investments, because these big investments normally are decided together between the Brazilian and the Chinese government. In some cases, they correspond to an important strategic vision by China, like the Interoceanic Road. But in other cases, there is a common interest in pursuing them. Where I think we could do better is in the area of trade. Because it's true that import tariffs in China are low, but there are a lot of licensing. There are the so-called protocols at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. And these protocols work like a traffic light. When what you intend to do is of interest of the Chinese government, you have the green light. When the Chinese government is indifferent, you have the yellow light. And when they are not interested, there is a red light, and forget about it, because you'll never be able to invest.
And don't run that red light.
No. So I think in the area of trade, there is also tariff escalation. There are the protocols. And what is important is that we do our homework in terms of productivity, in terms of competitivity, and we learn to negotiate with a completely different partner. Because when a Brazilian company negotiates with the Chinese companies, it never knows whether they are talking to a private company that will perform according to the rules of the market, or whether they are negotiating with the Chinese government with the intermediation of a Chinese company. The Chinese government has what I would say, like in a plane, you have the dashboard of the pilot with all the lights. So sometimes they increase the green light or decrease the yellow light, decrease the red light, but they have a view of the set of projects of cooperation. We don't have that.
Yeah.
Because we are a market economy, we got used, private companies negotiate on their own. So this creates an imbalance in our capacity to negotiate.
I want to ask you one last, I think, pivotal question before turning over to the panel. But we're in Washington, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the United States. You mentioned trade. In 2012, China took over the U.S. Spot as Brazil's major trading partner, largest trading partner. The same has occurred more recently in Chile as well as in Peru. So to what extent do you see increasing ties with China affecting Brazil's relationship with the United States, or do you, and what else do you see from a Brazilian perspective, things that the U.S. could be doing to really help to rejuvenate some of that potential opportunity?
I think it's important to stress that China became our first trading partner, but we have run a surplus with China in all recent years from the beginning. And the United States is the second trading partner, and fortunately, we didn't run any surplus with the United States, which is something important at the present moment. But I think it's not in the area of trade. We have a very good trade relations with both the United States and with China. China may be growing, but the quality of our relation with the U.S. is better because we export much more manufacturing products. We may consider to be a point in which may affect the United States is in the area of competition between China and the United States in Latin America. China has a wider presence, it's growing fast, and in a time, as I mentioned, where the relationship among these two big powers is still to be better shaped, of course, the United States may be losing ground with respect to opportunities for investment, of increase in participation in the market, and even in the political aspects. Because if China concentrates on business, on the economy, it has also a political downside. Mm-hmm. And that's we may see, for instance, in the fact that BRICS means something from a political point of view. We share a common goal of higher participation in the decision-making process in the world scene. And we also have a presence in Latin America which is growing politically. And I will give you an example. When President Xi Jinping visited Brazil, he had a meeting with presidents from CELAC in Brazil. This had never happened before.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us for this excellent conversation.
Thank you.
If you could just hold, as they're bringing the chairs, just before moving on to the panel, where we're going to talk about the report in greater detail, I'd also like to take this moment to also acknowledge one of the other co-authors of the report who's not in the panel, which is Sean Miner, who's in the second row. Sean is the China Latin America Fellow at the Adrian Arce Latin America Center and has been instrumental in leading our China work and is a co-author of this report. It's now my pleasure to hand over the conversation to Sean Donnan, the FT's World Trade Editor, and I will also add to your bio, Sean, like I added to the ambassadors, a friend of the Atlantic Council. Sean currently leads coverage of trade and globalization issues and was also previously Deputy Asia Director at FT. Sean will moderate a star-studded panel with the IDB Chief Economist, a friend as well, Jose Juan Ruiz, the OECD Development Center's Latin American Caribbean head, Angel Melguizo, a report co-author, and also Claire Reed, who served as Assistant USTR for China. So, Ambassador, again, thank you very much for this excellent conversation. Sean, over to you.
So excuse me if I flinch slightly, because every time we move our house, we end up with a whole room full of boxes. So it's, we'll go there. Okay, thank you. Why don't you guys come up on stage here? Maybe we'll give ourselves a little bit of elbow room here. Yeah. I'm going to depart from the script slightly, and I'm not going to introduce everyone here and give you a kind of chapter and verse in their bio. As I understand it, their bios are in the packs that you have there, and we've got a great report to discuss. I had the pleasure of reading this by the pool yesterday out of Montgomery County as the kids were playing in the pool, and I got to say it really is an excellent piece of work, and it's wonderful to see HSBC and the Atlantic Council, but also the OECD cooperating on this kind of thing. This is what we at the FT love to track, right? The way money moves around the world, the way influence changes, the way kind of geopolitics collides with capital and business. I mean, it says something that I enjoyed reading it by the pool yesterday. I wanted to start off with you, Angel. I mean, this figure that you kind of lead with, $110 billion in Chinese investment in Latin America since 2013. That doesn't really tell the story, because it's really a story of much of that coming just in the last couple of years, really. So just walk us through how that's kind of accelerated.
No, but first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I aspire to become one of the friends of the Atlantic Council. I'm not yet there, but hopefully in next time. So, but it's clear that China is a game changer for the world economies, and is a game changer for Latin America. What we try to do in this project that we are doing with the Atlantic Council, and I would like to acknowledge some minor leadership in this research, is to get deeper a bit on one of the economic ties that Latin America and China have, which is foreign direct investment. I think we try to fight a long story of underreporting of the investment of China in Latin America, providing figures open to you all to analyze and to get a more precise sense of what is happening. $110 billion from the 2003, $70 billion in the last 5 years, wow, which is really, really a change. Besides FDI flows, that's this financial flow between China and Latin America is a bit less concentrated, or even a bit more diversified than other relationship between China and Latin America, notably trade and loans. It's true that Brazil leads the way, but also Caribbean countries, Peru, Bolivia, more than 10% of the GDP is represented by the FDI, and also Argentina, and lately Mexico. Mexico, one of these countries that was so far from China. And the last piece of information I want to share is also the sectoral dimension. Still, FDI flows between China and Latin America are a story of extractive industries, of mining, metal, oil. More than 50% of all these flows in the last 15 years are related to commodities. But in the last 5 years, things are changing, as was mentioned, and financial services, internet, telecommunication, electricity, and renewable energies represent more than half of the financial flows between Latin America and China in the last 5 years. So all in all, we think we are providing data for reflection, and we are just confirming that Latin America and China is a partnership to be built. Now, Latin America has to be more proactive. We cannot wait until China decides where to invest in which sectors. We also have to decide which is the kind of development that we want to have. But it's a partner that, with certain policies, I think we can benefit.
So let's just build on that with you, Angel, just a little bit there, because we heard from the ambassador that we are talking about strategic investments here, but we're also, those of us who read the FT keep reading about this One Belt, One Road thing that China is doing, and that doesn't necessarily head towards Latin America. The great strategic priority for Xi Jinping has been recreating or renovating the Silk Road to Europe and so on. So how does Latin America fit in strategically? And then I don't quite understand this pivot to services. Well, that doesn't make sense to me. Why have we seen that?
Well, it's evident that China has certain priorities, and not necessarily just in Latin America, but all the announcements are in line of reinforcing, if anything, this relationship. No, the strategic documents in the mid-20s or last year of China investing in Latin America, all these complementarities between the restructuring and the transition in China and the needs for energy and to use their excess capacity means that Latin America is one of the partners. And our baseline projections, at least our scenario, is that trade is going to double in the next 10 years. Today, trade between Latin America and China represents $250 billion, and it might double in the next 10 years. Loans between China and Latin America represents $140 billion, and the announcements are that they will go on this flow. And all the factors behind this FDI boom in the last 5 years, we think are going to be there. So we are not still geographically in this road, but it's clear that we are in their map.
So it's one belt, one road with a spur. Yeah, go.
China can look more than one way down a road.
That's an outrageous proposition. Claire, I did want to come to, since we've already talked about running red lights, I would highly recommend that you keep your eyes on the road ahead, both hands on the wheel and so on. Claire, we're going to jump straight to this question of kind of what this means for the U.S. And kind of U.S. response. You, until a couple of years ago, were sitting over at USTR thinking about China and its impact on the world. In fact, dealing with trade enforcement with China and some of those non-tariff barriers and protocols and red lights, green lights, and amber lights that the ambassador was talking about, and so on. When you look at a number like the surge in FDI in Latin America, how do you respond, and what does it mean for the U.S.?
Well, I think the report speaks to some of it, and I think the ambassador also noted some of the key issues. I mean, I think for Latin America, we're always looking from the United States perspective at the question of leverage. So for Latin America, this relationship offers leverage, right? It offers more options, which then from the United States point of view means that the United States has to take this into account. And to the extent that, Latin America has felt that it is the little brother or the whatever, this offers opportunities for there to be a shift in the relationship to some extent, assuming that the United States is looking and understands what's going on and why it matters to the U.S. It's also been noted that the Chinese investment, in particular the loans, have allowed Latin American leaders to achieve their national goals. So that's good for a good governance country. That's maybe not so good for a bad governance country and potentially leaves them in place longer. So from the United States position, that's not necessarily a positive development. If you just look at the United States and China together and you look at the risks, this is not different for any country, but China is not acting as a selfless global leader in moving into Latin America. It's doing this for its self-interest, and it's going to be, and it's demonstrated that it's quite opportunistic. So it needs natural resources. It needs to keep its economic growth going for its own political stability reasons. It wants to create national champions who will be dominant not only in China but also globally. And it wants to influence global rules, as the ambassador noted, and it also has military security issues. So all of these, I think, are at play in Latin America, and I think the United States has to look at where those risks lie and potentially think about what it can do about them.
Well, we'll get to that next. Walk us through the economic impact here. I mean, really, for Latin America, this is a meaningful sum of money. Is this behind some of the recovery we've seen in Latin America, and is this going to help it?
Thank you, John. Let me put just an historical note about the One Road, One Seal. The first link between America and the Asia was the Galeon de Manila, which linked Acapulco with Manila and China. This was the way that the Spanish silver and the American silver entered the world economy. Was just, if they want to look at that road, maybe they have to look at the Pacific and see what happened there. Well, to your question, I think that we have there two levels to answer the question. The first one is that without any doubt, China has been one of the driving forces that has pushed prosperity in Latin America in the last 15 years. The super commodity boom that we have had in the past, which has created the Latin American middle class, which has increased GDP per capita, has changed maybe forever the social and political dynamics of Latin America rest on the prosperity that brought this increased trade with between Latin America and China. And I think this has been very important. There has been a second layer of this thing. If you look at the numbers and you look at the way China has been investing in Latin America, I will not be as excited as the ambassador or maybe the report, which is a great report, about the diversification of investment in Latin America. If you look back, what you see is that most of the investment, it's concentrated in a handful of countries, the largest economies in Latin America. It's concentrated, at least until now, in a very few sectors. And what's even more worrying for Latin America and the future, the correlation between this investment and the rule of law and good governance in Latin America is not as impressive that it used to be when you look at other behaviors, other patterns of behavior in other foreign direct investment countries. I think it's not true that they don't pay, they don't respect rule of law. This is not true. But it seems to me that the rule of law indicators are not a very large consideration in the decision to make foreign investment. And when you look now what is going on in Latin America, I think this idea of rule of law, transparency, democracy, I think it's also very important for the future of Latin America, and I would like to see these factors much better improve. And the third point is we are looking, in my way, to this relationship just in one way, China investing in Latin America. And this is a good thing and has been a major source of welfare in Latin America. But maybe we need to begin to think about what happens if Latin America tries to invest in China. We are small countries, and maybe this is going to be something that we have to keep in mind coming for the future. And as Claire was saying, if there is some fundamental change in trade relations between Latin America and the United States, my feeling is that Latin America is going to be impelled to have a much larger regional integration process, and this could create the opportunity to have a much better reciprocity investment from Latin America and China. Instead of having 200 million people, as the ambassador was saying, or 102 million people from Mexico. If you put together the 500 million people that you have in Latin America with an average GDP per capita, which is around $15,000, I think this creates an internal market which could be negotiating in a much better position with China. This, I think, is important. And the second one, if you ask me, what could be the most disrupting impact of China on Latin America, I will say a very, very simple and expectable factor. In some moment, China is going to open their internal bond market. And if China open the internal bond markets, this is going to have a direct impact on Latin America, and this time it's not going to
because it'll suck all the demand.
And this is something that is going to happen. I don't know when, but it seems to me that we have to build now very good relation with China because it's very important for us, but we also have to prepare ourselves to what kind of financial disturbance can happen if this China market, which is going to be huge, and it's now huge, but it's close to foreign investors. If it's open, this could mean that a substantial share of bonds today held in investor in Latin American bonds in the hands of foreign investors are going to be moved to China.
And it wouldn't just be a Latin American impact; it'd be an
impact
for the
world
emerging
economy.
markets.
Yeah, for the world economy.
I just want to build a little bit on a few things that you said there, Jose Juan. But Angel, just first of all, you talk in the report about a sustainable path in terms of Chinese FDI. I think a few years ago, 5 years ago, the debate would have been over whether the commodity super cycle was sustainable, and there would have been people arguing that it is sustainable. So make the case. Why is this sustainable?
Everything is sustainable until it is not. And I'm not good at projections, but what we identified in the report are some of the factors that are behind, let's say, the latest flows. Pull and push factors. The first one is this going out strategy of China, that moving abroad and diversifying the different partners, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Secondly, we see an excess of capacity because this transition of China towards an economy mostly based on services and not just on industry, and the need to feed their population and to secure some energy sources. This is going to be there in the next few years. Secondly, we see Latin America that has reduced the restrictions to FDI. Today, many countries in Latin America have restrictions that are lower than the ones that the US imposes, for instance, and very much in line with the OECD average. We don't expect Latin America to increase the restrictions to investment. And the fourth factor is the world that we are living in today. I mean, with voices in certain countries not really fostering globalization and not fostering movement.
It's okay. You can say this country.
My expertise stops in the border, actually. Okay. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, I'll say it then.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure she knows much more. But there's another challenge. So these four dimensions are going to be there, but they are purely economical. There are other dimensions of sustainability that I think should be put on the table, and one is the social one, and the other one is the environmental. And here is Latin America has to do something. So we cannot just wait to see where the investment go or to see whether the investment has a certain environmental impact or not. We have to be more proactive, and here integration is also a matter of how to respond and how to bargain, how to negotiate with China. So sustainability, we think that is there, but especially in the social and the environmental side, it very much depends on Latin America.
Claire, do you want to build on that at all? I mean, from a U.S. perspective, do you look at this Chinese FDI as a kind of flash in the pan, or do you think this is a long-term sustainable trend that the U.S. should be worrying about?
I am not an economist, and so I base my...
As a strategist.
That's very.
I mean, China's, the push-pull that Angel was just talking about is a fundamental feature of China's economy. And so they're going to look where they can. So they've already looked in Latin America. They've already accelerated in Latin America. I don't see a trend in Latin America that would cause them to slow up or turn around and go back. So I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that the points that have been raised about the need for Latin America to come to the table as a savvy negotiator is a very, very good point. And it's the kind of thing that the ambassador also pointed to, which is negotiating with China is a monumental task, and it does require preparation and a very clear understanding of what you're dealing with, as well as leverage. So the points that were made about a unified, Latin American population and a united, America of south of the U.S. border, that from an economic bloc perspective would be amazing and potentially very valuable. Because understanding that China talks about win-win, but many in China have a zero-sum game viewpoint. And given that, and it's the law of the jungle, the question is who's going to be aware and ready, and who's going to defend their interests more effectively, and who's going to be maybe asleep and a little slower. And everybody needs to be awake if we want the global economic system to function correctly. Because one last point, which is Angel and the ambassador's point about state-owned enterprises.
Yeah.
The absence of market-driven decision-making, if you believe in markets, is very troubling. So the notion of an increasingly strengthened China as it goes out with a consistent use of non-market factors for its investment and its operations is also something that I think we need to be paying attention to.
And that's always something that kind of undermines it's always, why are they here, right? There's always a question. Why is this SOE kind of coming into my backyard? Question that often you talk about in terms of China FDI in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and certainly in other parts of the world. It's not just a Latin American phenomenon. I want to talk a little bit about something you talk about in the report, which is soft power. Right, in China. I was recently in Buenos Aires for the World Economic Forum there, and I came up with an idea, and my apologies to Brazil here, but that Lionel Messi had more soft power than China in the world here. And I think there's a point here that actually both Brazil and Argentina have a huge amount of soft power in the world. A Brazilian walks into a bar just about anywhere in the world, he'll find people who want to buy him drinks. You know,
Don't forget Neymar.
Don't forget Neymar. Yeah, we won't forget Neymar. But the I knew that was a difficult road to go down. There, as an Arsenal fan, I could bring up Chile and Alexis Sanchez. But but no, I think this question of soft power is very real. In Africa, we've seen backlash against Chinese investment, and part of that is driven by the suspicion. And it's not just soft power; it's governance. But soft power has a big deal to do with it. So how do you, when you look at Chinese soft power in Latin America nowadays, do you see any? You know, this is the question.
Yeah, I think I don't think it's really very strong. I mean that what people perceive it's a clear rising leader in the world economy that you have to pay attention. You have to know much better. But I wouldn't say that in Latin America we have a good knowledge about the culture and the features of the Chinese history that could be used in the proper way. What to me it seems is that this power can be created if the other powers draw back from their present position. I just was thinking, if you ask to any economist in Latin America, which are the main breaks, the main obstacles to our development, most of them will say infrastructure. We lack infrastructure, of course. Other people will say education, sure, inequality. But infrastructure seems to me that is there, and it's a very large impediment to development.
And that's where China is very active.
Yeah. And China is there.
Yeah.
But if you say to maybe to other people in another area, which are your main concern, world concern, which is the world concern that you share, you will say climate change. Because Latin America is also a very exposed of the Caribbean, but they also have the perception that they are really a place where climate change can be very important, and they have a lot of reserves, and they could put at risk their natural wealth if this is not dealt in the proper way. If you put together infrastructure and climate change, what appears is something that is lacking in Latin America, finance, and this is called green bonds. And China, in my view, is going to use this kind of relation between infrastructure projects which comply with much more conditionality and safeguards that's up to now, with this idea of you are the natural reserve of the world, plus here is the money that is coming from green bonds. And I think this triangle, it's something that could give China this idea of sustainability that you were asking for. Based on infrastructure and climate change, Latin America can have in China another partner for the next 25 years.
And Heli, you were just looking something up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, when we are talking about these investments and this FDI of China in Latin America, I was checking that the figure, 4 billion are going to alternative energies, wind, solar, hydro. So this is something that Latin America needs and that China is providing. This boom of FDI of Latin America, in Latin America of China came in the last 5 years. The last 5 years are the worst 5 years of Latin America in a while. Actually, the last 2 years were the worst since the 80s. So these are the years where Latin America needed the most investment, and China arrived with $70 billion. And this is the time when some governments needed finance. 2016 was the peak year of loans of China to Latin America if we take out 2010, which was exceptional. So obviously this is matching the needs of a region that was looking outside.
But Angel, if you, yeah. I fully agree with you that they appear when they were mostly needed, but they appear just in a few countries. They appear in Venezuela, they appear in Ecuador, they appear in Argentina, and something that is going to be, in my view, very, very informative about what can happen in the world is how China is going to deal with a potential default in Venezuela. For the first time, it's going to be one of the major lenders to Venezuela, and they have not been in this scheme for years, maybe for the whole history, and we are going to see how they deal with that in the bilateral way that maybe some people think is going to happen, or they are going to use the multilateral institution. And I think this is something, it's time that you progress and you make more important, you have to show your cards. And I think this is going to be a major event for the relation between China and Latin America. How this issue, if happens, could be dealt by the authorities in China.
No, absolutely. 9 out of 10 yuans in loans from China to Latin America went to Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and Venezuela. 9 out of 10. But in the last year, China stopped the financing to Venezuela. So I think they are already doing the
Right.
adjustment.
No, but
Probably
it's not the ongoing problem. This is
Yeah.
the unsustainability that you were referring to. But now it's when the problem appears.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you have the default. There is when the diplomacy and all these skills that Claire was informing us, it's going to be needed.
Yeah, and Venezuela is going to be a huge test, as you say. I know at the IMF that's certainly what they're thinking in terms. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Both in terms of the system and how it responds to a crisis in Venezuela, and what will be a political crisis as well, or is already a political crisis. But then Chinese leadership. I mean, it's one thing to stand up at Davos and proclaim leadership. It's another thing to actually act and pull the levers and get the system working.
Can I just put a footnote, though, on soft power that China's already developed, and that is obviously not with all of Latin America, but through the BRICS, and the kind of representative symbolism of a large Latin American country joining with China as a co-equal in this effort to think through the creation of new balance in the global rules and potential finance vehicles and those kinds of things. I think that's an effort by China to exert its soft power, and I think it's you'd have to call that at least some strategic success.
Yeah. Although the acronym is a Goldman Sachs acronym. But I wanted to come back to you, Claire, just on this question of how does the U.S. respond before we move to the floor. We've just got a few minutes left. So a year ago, we would have sat here and we would have talked about the great response being the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we often think about in this town as an Asian project, but was a Pacific Rim project. And with Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Mexico involved, 3 of the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance involved. You could see the beginning of what I started thinking about as the ravioli plate, right? So Jagdish Bhagwati used to talk about the noodle bowl of all these bilateral deals. My theory was that with all these regional deals, we're going to get this ravioli plate, and then someday you would bake it together into a lasagna. And that one of the first things you would do is you would bolt on the Pacific Alliance to the TPP. Then you'd start talking about regional integration in Latin America in terms of the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur getting along better and bringing them in as well. But that all seems to have kind of fallen off the wayside or been pushed out of the way there. How does the U.S. respond now, and how should it be responding?
Well, that's very difficult. I mean, as a China person, I found the TPP to be a very strategic vehicle for pushing China to take on the responsibilities that were set out in this rule book, and for creating a kind of safe space for countries that were willing to take the next step on trade to do that and have an economically robust region in which to get the benefits of that relationship. So it's difficult, and I having seen bilateral deals compared to multilateral deals, the multiplier effect of a multilateral agreement in economic terms is, I think, undeniable. So it's tough to think about any kind of bilateral relations managing to fill in a gap quickly. Now, I was heartened to hear that TTIP is on the agenda, and I've often thought that maybe the EU is one something. Obviously, Brexit make that a little more complicated, but the NAFTA is another potential place where I think everyone is going to be watching vis-a-vis Latin America. And I must say that, the Mexican economy is a tiny dot. So in terms of the notion of any job losses or anything being due to Mexico, it seems not so credible to me. But if you look at the larger picture of the benefits that we get from having prosperous and stable neighbors with regard to drugs and immigration and just general security issues, I think that we need to pay very close attention to the countries that are to our south and the country that is to our north. So I'm hoping even from the perspective of an administration that is saying it's America first, that it will understand that to be America best, you need to be looking with some sophistication at your self-interest.
Jose Juan, do you want to jump in?
No, I think I fully agree. I think for Latin America, this could be a very good time to get closer integration and to have this sense of diversification and to put their interests first. I wouldn't say that the interest of Latin America is to become a regional area. This is nonsense. We are 6% of GDP, but world GDP. But what maybe these events could push up us is to try to, based on this closer regional integration, to get a much better insertion in the world economy, something that has not happened in the last 200 years. And this could be a very good opportunity. I think that China and US are key if we want to do that. Both of them, you cannot play against, neither one nor the other.
Yeah, it's a bit like combining the Brazilian and the Argentinian football teams, right? Yeah. You would have a remarkable impact on the global economy if you did that.
Nine World Cups. And if you put Uruguay and you get Mercosur, then you have 11.
Angel.
No, absolutely. I think first of all, Europe is another partner that we should put on the table, and Europe is much more than the UK. Now we have hope coming from France. We have hope that there's something really powerful coming from Europe, and it's clear one of the partners. We are talking about a region that invests FDI from Europe to Latin America is 3 times the investment of China. And trade is between double and 3 times. So this is the dimension of Europe with Latin America. So it has to be factored in. But I agree with Jose Juan. Now is the time for a Latin America that acts a bit more together. We are going this week to the Pacific Alliance Summit in Cali. Hopefully there will be some positioning, because if not, this is too unbalanced. So this negotiation and this positioning of Latin America cannot be just bilateral negotiation, but has to be more coordinated one.
You make a very good point on Europe, where the U.S. should also be paying attention to that. EU trade negotiators are in Mexico City today for a second round of renegotiations of an EU-Mexico deal that is already further along than the renegotiation of NAFTA in a way. And that's, you listen to Wilbur Ross, and he talks about his concerns over cars being exported from Mexico to the EU to take advantage of a trade deal like that already. So
and Mercosur negotiation has been reopened again.
Yeah. After, I think these are now 14,
years.
16 years old, and so on. Why don't we go to the floor here quickly, and I'm going to do something radical, and I'm going to start in the back row and come forward here. So all the way, the last hand in the back, there's a young man there with his hand up. We'll start there. This is, just wait for the microphone for a second. Yeah. And if you could identify yourself, and I'm just going to ask you questions only, please. The speeches can come over coffee afterwards.
Hello, my name is Mario Zampaglione. I'm at the International Crisis Group. I had a question for all panelists. In regards and in light to the corruption scandals you've seen in Latin America over the past few years, are there concerns that the high level of capital coming from China will fuel corruption despite
Okay.
crackdowns in the last years? Thank you.
That's a good question. I mean, you started to address that, Jose, one with your questions about governance, but
No, I think that for Latin America today, good governance is a priority. If you ask every politician in Latin America, every city in Latin America, and you ask them to rank which is the most important problem for Latin America, they are going to tell you that is corruption, and therefore everything that could rise suspects of that something wrong has happened is going to be a very bad deal.
okay, if we can go just forward on the aisle here. We're coming from the back forward here. In the suit, he's got his hand up. Get the man a microphone.
Thank you. My name is Max Trujillo. I have my own government relations firm. My question is, you mentioned the situation in the Caribbean and the Chinese that the Chinese has with Venezuela. I'm sorry, Venezuela has with China. What about the credits that Venezuela has through Petrocaribe, through the entire Caribbean basin? What will be the impact if suddenly, indirectly, China becomes a creditor to them because of the default of Venezuela?
Okay,
Thank you.
good question.
Well, this has been hugely diminished in the last 2 years. You have to divide the countries in two kind of countries. Those countries that could tap the market, if the numbers could be 2-3% of GDP. Those markets are going to pay a higher interest rate for the debt, but this is not going to be a major disruption. You have other kind of countries which are smaller economies with a smaller stocks of debt. Those countries we cannot tap the markets have to make an adjustment. And this is something that has been happening in the last couple of years. Nicaragua has been absorbing some of the subsidies that came from Venezuela, and Barbados has been doing the same. You have seen how some of the debt of Costa Rica, for instance, in the scheme of Petrocaribe was rebought by the Costa Rica. I think this is a problem that maybe 5 years ago was really a important problem for some of the small Caribbean countries. Today it's a problem, but it's not as, it's just affecting very specific countries. It's not going to be, in my view, a major disruption between the relation between Venezuela and the others. I think they have more serious problems than just Petrocaribe.
Okay, we'll just keep moving through the room here, and just on the aisle right there, man in the beard.
Okay, my name is Nick Boros with TDI. To turn this into a question, per Howard French's book about the Chinese presence in Africa, which shows how diverse and multifaceted the Chinese presence really is there, do you think that the master plan of China is overemphasized? And have you taken this into account with your own analysis of Chinese-Latin American relations?
And how?
Can you repeat the question?
So I think what he's pointing to a very good book by Howard French, former New York Times journalist, about China's role in Africa there. And one of the points that Howard makes is just how diversified that is, but also how it's not necessarily a great plan, right? It wasn't a great strategic plan. It kind of happened in an ad hoc manner. Do you think there's a great strategic plan for Latin America, or is this happening in a kind of ad hoc way? Did I get it right? Sort of?
There is a plan, but is it overemphasized?
Okay, there is a plan, but is it overemphasized?
No, I think there are two official strategic documents of China versus Latin America that are published in 2006 and 2007 and 2016. They really have a plan. The region that doesn't have a plan in this relationship is Latin America. Because we are just in a wait-and-see mode, both in terms of financing, in trade, and in FDI. I think they have that plan. I mean, and it really matches their transition of an economy from industry to services, with an emerging middle class that is going to be demanding much more, and with a different appetite for certain commodities that are the one they are looking for. So I wouldn't overestimate at all the plan that they have.
Claire?
On a concrete basis, I think you may want to distinguish between the state-owned enterprises who are taking direct strategic direction from China and private enterprise. And to some extent that the entrepreneurial spirit and private enterprise may be what account for some of the seemingly more random diversification that's more opportunistic as people are actually seeing market opportunities.
Next question, and we're going to come onto the aisle here. Just keep your hand up. It's coming from the other side. Microphone behind you.
Thank you very much. Evan Ellis, U.S. Army War College. As you know, any estimation of FDI has always been methodologically very problematic. There's the problem with the reporting of FDI by Chinese companies, which, if you believe it all, everything goes into the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, et cetera. There's the problem of reporting public M&A versus actually knowing the investments behind the scenes. Could you talk a little bit about how you and obviously the Sapal report on which many of the others was based was very problematic. Could you talk a little bit about how you overcame these methodological problems for your current FDI estimate?
As good as we could. Our estimates are 20 times higher than the estimates of ECLAC, United Nations for Latin America, and more or less 4 times higher than the IMF estimates. But we think we are closer to the truth. We are trying to get properly accounted what is done through Hong Kong. We are trying to get also properly accounted what is done through subsidiaries firms. And finally, one of the limitation of doing this analysis for Latin America is that many countries in Latin America don't report the origin of the FDI. So we went to the 2 best sources of data, and this is what we got. Obviously, that might be some operations that are not accounted for, and some of the operations that we are accounting in might not be materialized at the end because some of the information is based on unannounced. But we think we are closer to a truth than other colleagues.
Back to the room here. We've got 3 people in the same row here. I think we're going to go left to right. So if you just stand up and get the man a microphone.
Hi, Roman Madaus from the East-West Center. I have a question about the grand strategic implications of the investment in Latin America by China. China's used its geoeconomic leverage in Asia against South Korea, Japan, the Philippines before, and to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't yet in Latin America. But is that something that's being talked about there? For instance, the Latin American countries on the Security Council, I could easily imagine China putting pressure on them to, say, abstain from a controversial vote in the future.
Okay. Since you guys are in the same row, we're going to take 3 questions together. We're also getting short in time, so just pass.
Thank you very much. My name is Dimitar Georgiev. I'm a political risk analyst. My question is, talk about the increase of Chinese trade around the world. How do you see that affecting the role of the U.S. dollar? And do you see potentially the U.S. using the U.S. dollar as a tool to remain relevant in negotiations that it's not part of? Thank you.
And just finally, just pass it over. 2 more. There you go.
Thank you very much. Rowan Rockefeller with the Broadcasting Board of Governors. My question is regarding public opinion within Latin America regarding this increased Chinese FDI. I was wondering, is the increase in Chinese FDI within Latin America being reported within Latin America by local media organizations? Is it being reported by Chinese-owned media organizations? And what is the response among Latin American public opinion?
Are there Chinese-owned media operations in Latin America?
Also a valid question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Claire, why don't we start with you on this kind of the strategic question and also the question of the dollar and the power of the great reserve currency and how you can use that to counterbalance China's increasing role in trade.
I think you might be better off asking the economists about the use of the dollar in any sort of technical way. One of the things that I think the United States is going to have to get very used to and figure out how to manage is the fact that China's economy is very large, is going to be larger. The population dwarfs the United States, and the United States is going to need to think about why it has leadership in the world and why it has influence and how it maintains that. To the extent that the dollar and non-politicization of the currency allows the United States to be a stable currency of last resort, I can say that's obviously a valuable position to be in, but I'm going to defer to my colleagues.
All right.
No, I think the problem for the yuan or the renminbi to become an international currency rests in a completely different place. You cannot have international currency, you have your capital account closed. You need to open your capital account if you really want to become a world currency. And I think this is going to happen at a Chinese pace because if they want to get advice from some expert in crisis, just call us Latin Americans and we will tell them the many mistakes you can make if you open your capital account without being prepared to make surveillance of your financial system. I think this is an important thing. Just picking up the question about the press, I think that local media in Latin America reports constantly about the foreign direct investment from China. I mean that normally as a success of the government who has got these foreign direct investment projects underway. Some from time to time, maybe in Peru, we have seen some other reporting due to the absence of some environment safeguards and labor safeguards. Most or some of the projects in infrastructure in Latin America come with some attachment that has to be made by people coming from Asia who are covered when they work in Latin America by local labor laws. And in some cases, what we have seen is that there has been some kind of exception regime for these laborers from Asia which are working in some Latin American countries, and the press has reported about that. But I don't see people seeing this foreign direct investment situation as a risk, not for the time being at least. Latin America has been receiving foreign direct investment for the next 60 years. And my perception that they see foreign direct investment in much better terms than when you report that they are tapping the capital markets and increasing the debt. Foreign direct investment is something like a substitute for more debt. And therefore, I think that the feeling is that it's better. This is the good cholesterol, and the bad cholesterol is that.
I think what Jose Juan is really saying there is there's no fake news in Latin America. You've been very patient in the front row here, and so just get the microphone to you.
Robert Schroeder, International Investor. We heard from the ambassador and several others here now about the long-term strategic thinking behind China on some of these investments. Could there be a concern of loss of control in that, as we heard from the ambassador, they in some cases buy the energy, metals, or agriculture commodities. They put the transportation system in, or the infrastructure to the port. They buy control of the port. They have their own shipping to deliver. So when they're trying to satisfy a 1.3 billion person economy, is there a sense that this could put price pressure on Latin American citizens for some of the very commodities that are coming from their own country, and that they will lose control of some of those strategic assets?
One of the reasons why Latin America has some problems in order to export is the lack of logistics and transportation. An investment of China to Latin America is arriving precisely to this sector. So it's up to Latin America also to use those assets that are being built there. I don't see really an investment of China in Latin America as some people say that it's investing in Africa that has no really value added left to the country. But here is also to Latin America to respond. Sometimes it's a matter of a lack of development of services around some of these commodity sectors. We have been seeing Chile developing services around mining, really value-added services around mining, and this is the way to go. Not just wait and see whether China is going to be building exits to the sea to take the commodities, but also to build around those assets that are there. because actually half of the FDI of China and Latin America is not mergers and acquisitions. It's greenfield investment. It's new investment that is arriving there. So it's not China just buying assets. It's also China putting capital in new sectors. So in this sense, I mean, I would be more balanced.
Jose Juan, do you want to add? Claire? No?
No.
We got a couple more. Okay, we're going to go middle of the room here. You've had your hand up for a little bit.
Stuart Michael Simpson, Simsco International. Question, I've been doing business down in South America for the last 8 years, and particularly Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina. To the trade representative, we established a relationship with Exim Bank, $2 billion under the Obama administration with China. Not one deal has ever been done. To Mr. Gomez, and this is my question to you, sir, and all three of you, you alluded to the structures of how you have to do business, particularly with China, which is a state-to-state operation, and how U.S. private sector investment can go in there. I can't tell you over $1 billion worth of projects that we developed to go in, and not one U.S. company could compete, because we have something called the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act. How do we get past that issue of total Chinese corruption, which Odebrecht and everybody else knows happens, and how do we compete with that in real terms to economic footholds in these countries in South America?
I think was my first reaction when you told me, you asked me, which is the most worrisome problem in Latin America, how people see Latin America today is corruption. And what has happened after some of the most big scandals in Latin America is that to some extent, the idea of corruption has been privatized. I mean, that corruption was understood just like the government and the policymakers and the officials. Now, people start to think that also companies could be involved in the corruption scandals and could be those who made the bribes. And I think this is going to put in motion in Latin America a new wave of legislation, besides the political effects that you can see in some countries. This is going to put a really new, completely different thing in Latin America. This is happening already in Colombia, it's happening in Peru, it's happening in Brazil, it can happen in Argentina. I think these are things that are changing nearly as fast as other things in Latin America. And I understand your worries, and I fully agree with you. It's really a very, very serious problem, that the lack of transparency of some deals is not the best way to increase governance.
Yeah, just reinforcing this message, the gap between what states are delivering and the demands from the population is priority number one for Latin America. But let me also add that it's also a matter of higher demands. I mean, in Latin America, this emerging middle class and this new movement and these youth people who are the first ones in history born and raised in democracy, technology savvy, who see how the world is working elsewhere, are putting a higher demand on government. So yes, we have to close this gap. The corruption is priority number one, but also let's recognize that there has been progress, and we are responding. We have to respond to higher standards, which is a good thing.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to close it there. I know there's a couple more questions in the room. I'd encourage you to come up and search out these eminent panelists afterwards, but the Atlantic Council made it very clear at the beginning of this event. They said, sometimes we begin a little bit late, but we always finish on time, and I think I've done that today. If you could just put your hands together for our panelists. And thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.